Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the WWF Insiders virtual event. My name is Miranda Snyder, and I work with WWF's Partners in Conservation. In a couple of minutes, I'll introduce Nalanga Jayasinghe, who will talk to us about her work to reduce human-wildlife conflict around the globe. Before I turn it over to Nalanga, I want to cover a few housekeeping items to make sure this virtual event runs smoothly. We will have time for questions following the presentation. If you have a question you would like to ask Nalanga, please use the Google form below the video player in your web browser. Our team behind the scenes will be monitoring that inbox throughout the presentation, and we will answer as many questions during the Q&A as we can. If you would like to maximize the size of your video screen, float your mouse over the video player and click on the expand icon at the far right of the toolbar on the bottom. To exit out of full screen mode, which you may want to do to submit a question, you can minimize your video by pressing the escape button on your keyboard. And a final note, we are recording today's webinar so we can share it on the WWF website. Now for today's topic. Our planet is under incredible pressure for natural resources. A rapidly rising human population coupled with habitat loss and impacts of climate change means that many communities around the globe are competing with local wildlife populations to meet their basic needs. Simply stated, human-wildlife conflict threatens the livelihoods and lives of people across the globe, while also creating significant risks to the survival of many species. Today, Nalanga Jayasinghe, Senior Program Officer for Asian Species, is going to talk to us about how WWF is working with communities to find practical solutions that will have a lasting impact to keep both wildlife and humans safe. It is now my pleasure to introduce Nalanga. Nalanga is a Senior Program Officer for Wildlife Conservation at WWF. She has extensive experience on conservation issues in Asia, Africa, and North America, with her areas of expertise including human-wildlife conflict, Asian elephants, connectivity conservation, and strategic planning, among others. Nalanga is a member of the Asian Elephant Specialist Group under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. She is also a member of the IUCN Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. Looking forward to hearing from you, and take it away, Nalanga.
Thank you, Miranda. And thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon or morning, as it may be the case for you, to hear a bit more about human-wildlife conflict and about what we're doing to address this conservation challenge. So to start off with, human-wildlife conflict is when humans and wildlife come into negative contact, when they have negative interactions with each other, which then lead to either loss of property, loss of livelihoods, loss of lives, and then in turn, retaliation against the wildlife that may be in these conflict situations with people. And human-wildlife conflict largely happens when habitat is lost, wildlife run out of resources, and then come into human-dominated areas in search of meeting their basic needs, pretty much. And then when that happens, the clash sometimes ends up with lives lost, people's crops or livestock lost, and then in turn, this results in anger among local communities that then leads to retaliatory killing of wildlife that may have been engaged in the situation. So you may think when you think of human-wildlife conflict that this is an issue or problem that's largely reserved to or unique to the developing world, where for the most part, yes, rural communities living in developing countries are the most impacted by this issue, but it's not common just to countries that we think of are far away, or that it's an issue that's disconnected from us here in North America, for instance. If you think about, you may be suddenly realizing that your cats are going missing in your neighborhood. If you're living in an area that suddenly where you see a coyote coming around, that's human-wildlife conflict. The coyote may come around and, take your cats or other, livestock, your hens. A fox may come into your backyard and take your, hens or your chicks out of the coop. Or suddenly you might go into your backyard and there may be a raccoon in your garbage can. That's human-wildlife conflict. And I think it's common to all of us because wherever we live, where the urban interface connects with the wild, or places where wildlife may be dispersing into urban areas, you are going to find human-wildlife conflict. So it's not common to places that we think are far away. It is an issue that's common for all of us. And it's only an issue that's going to increase in the future as we are going to experience more threats to the natural world, more habitat loss, more impacts of climate change, et cetera. So this is an issue that we really are thinking significantly about addressing because, as I mentioned, it's only going to increase in the future. So let's look at human-wildlife conflict contexts in a little trip around the world. And I will talk about some of the things that we're doing to address the situation and reduce and manage human-wildlife conflict. First, let's go to the Arctic. As you see in this picture, is one of our flagship species, the polar bear. Polar bears are struggling today, as you may well be aware, because of climate change impacts to their habitats. They are experiencing increasing melting of sea ice. They rely on sea ice for hunting prey and for living out much of their lives. And so because with the loss of sea ice, they're now driven by nutritional needs. They're hungry, unable to find prey, and are more often than not drawn to human inhabited areas in the Arctic region. For instance, they are drawn to villages where people may have their stores of meat that may be in their houses or in containers outside that the bears can smell and then are attracted to. So when they're attracted to these smells, then they may show up in someone's village. And that's a really, really dangerous situation because polar bears are extremely large. And if somebody steps out their door and suddenly there's a bear outside, that could lead to a really, really dangerous situation. In addition, bears are also attracted to garbage dumps in these areas, in these community areas where people have set aside specific allotments to get rid of their garbage. And the smell may also attract bears, and that can also lead to a really dangerous situation. So a big issue there, I think, in the Arctic is really a lot about managing your attractants. If you have, meat that you're trying to store for a long period of time through the winter for your sustenance, WWF is working with communities, for instance, to help install bear-proof food storage bins. You may have seen bear-proof garbage cans or dumpsters as you go camping, and maybe out in Yellowstone or anywhere else in the US, for instance, where bears are also, black bears or brown bears are drawn to your food stores. So like locking them in there and keeping them safe will keep the bears from getting into them. But also it's really important to note that polar bears in particular, are extremely intelligent and will try to figure out how to get past these, barriers that are in their way of getting to food. So these bear-proof containers or dumpsters also have to be extremely, bear-proof or airtight. And so, you have to always stay one step ahead of these animals that are like extremely intelligent and will somehow figure out a way. In addition, it's important to note that we have been working with communities in these villages in the Arctic to develop response teams that they're trained on, bear biology, how to safely drive bears away, and are there to respond to cases of bear incursions in villages. My colleague Elizabeth Kruger, who is a polar bear expert working out of our Alaska office, mentioned that in 2019, during conversations with the patrol team in a small community in Alaska, Kaktovik, had actually reported that there had been around 600 cases of, patrols being summoned for cases of, bear incursions over a period of 6 months. So you can imagine that this is a natural or regular occurrence that's happening these days, and it's only increasing. So we have to be, vigilant and stay one step ahead to help manage these conflicts and keep both people and bears safe from each other. Next, we'll travel to the African continent, where we'll talk about one of my favorite species, the elephant. This is the African elephant, and in Africa, research has shown that between the years of 2010 and 2017 in Kenya, about 200 people were killed in that period of time as a result of human-elephant conflict. And also about 50 to 120 elephants were lethally controlled as a result of these conflicts by wildlife authorities. So this is a significant issue, where elephants are found. Elephants are large, wide-ranging species that need a lot of, have a lot of resource needs. And as they travel through, their terrain or their range, they're often bound to encounter people because many of their historic range is also now largely occupied by human communities. So in these cases, as they're traveling through these community areas, they may often compete with people over water resources. Either, rivers, access to rivers may be blocked by villages or communities in those areas that may also be going down to the river to get their water. Elephants may also show up, which can lead to a really dangerous standoff or situation where there may be conflict. Also, people's water tanks in their villages, if they're not fortified and secure, elephants may come in and try to get into the water sources in those tanks. So as you can see in this image, a couple of elephants had shown up overnight and had destroyed the water tank that communities also draw their water from. So some of the solutions, that we have been able to engage with communities on is providing these fortified tanks that elephants are then unable to break into, but also an elevated system through which they can actually draw their water as it's pumped out of the tank. So these have been some solutions that have proven to be effective over time, and communities are able to access their water, but there are also ways to then safely enable elephants and other wildlife to move towards natural water sources where they can access those resources without competing with people. At the same time, elephants also really, if they're walking by a crop field, they may be tempted to stop by and have, snack on some maize or some rice or anything like that people may be growing. And so this leads to a lot of, loss of income for local communities that may simply be subsisting on these harvests for their livelihoods. And for many rural communities, sometimes it can even amount to about a year's worth of loss of income from a single elephant visit to their crop field. So historically, traditionally, communities have done things like, beat on drums to make noise to drive elephants away, do light, put fires up and try to, scare the elephants away. But over time, that has proven to be not as effective because elephants are also very smart and can become more bold over time as they get to, attempt to get to the food resources that they're really wanting at that time. So another, a tool that has been tried and that has proven to be effective largely is the use of chili fences, which means the dung of the elephant is mixed with really hot chili pepper paste or chili powder, and then it's applied on fences. And that is supposed to deter the elephant because, the smell is very strong, the strong smell of the pepper, along with how it is supposed to burn the skin of the elephant if it touches it, has led to it being a deterrent. But then again, elephants are also very smart and have figured out, ways to get past barriers that are put in their way. And I'll talk more about that, as we move further in the presentation. But these are some of the tools that have been tried and are being tried. And also another interesting tool that I saw for myself during a trip to Kenya this is in the Mara, where elephants are also driven away from community areas with the use of drones. You'll see in this image on the top left corner is the drone that's hovering right above the elephants, and they are bothered by it and do move away as it's attempting to guide the elephants away from community areas. So now let's go further east to the continent of Asia. So I work on Asian species conservation here at WWF, and so many of the species that I work on, including the cousins of the African elephants, the Asian elephants, are found in this one circle in Asia. But if you look at this comparison, this circle also is the area that holds the world's biggest population. The most number of people in the whole world live in the same circle as do the species that we care about and are working to conserve. So when you think about that, the pressure is tremendous. The pressure competing, human needs for land resources competing with wildlife needs for the same. So it has led to significant habitat loss in Asia, which has led to a lot of pressure for wildlife. And this is really evident in the case of the Asian elephant that is really struggling a lot with habitat loss. While if you think about African elephants, the biggest threat to African elephants today is poaching for their tusks. But if you think of Asian elephants, the biggest threat to them is the threat of habitat loss and resulting human-elephant conflict. Human-elephant conflict has led to significant numbers of elephant deaths over the years. For instance, in India alone, an average of about, right now, the stat is that about 500 people and about 100 elephants are killed every year as a result of human-elephant conflict. So this image is from a palm oil plantation in Sabah, Borneo, where much of the elephant habitat has been lost, and elephants are mostly found inside these, palm oil plantations because they have pretty much not a lot of other space to go to. So these lead to situations of, encounters with people and human-wildlife conflict. And in this next image, you'll see that elephants have gone through a paddy field. The rice is, ripening. They may not have necessarily eaten the crop as they move through, but just even moving through is enough to destroy a significant chunk of that field. So again, it leads to, tremendous, a loss of income for people. Sometimes it leads to, this type of destruction just in people's backyards where, banana plantation has been destroyed. And then also it can lead to the loss of people's homes. Elephants may come trying to, find grains or vegetables or stores inside people's homes and may break in trying to get at them. So this leads to significant damage, crop property, and even sometimes lives. Human lives are lost, as I mentioned, and in turn, elephants are retaliated against. So a key tool that is being used to prevent elephants from coming into human areas is use of electric fencing. This is also being tried in certain parts of Africa, but in Asia, it's very, predominantly used as a way to keep particularly elephants out of crop fields and community areas. The thing with this is it's very effective, but the only thing is you have to maintain the electric fence. You can't make sure anything is touching the wire that would break the current. You have to maintain it on a regular basis. Once that is done, and if you're keeping an eye out, regularly monitoring them, it can be extremely effective against elephants getting in. But let's go back to the point that I mentioned before, that elephants are extremely smart, very intelligent. I actually saw evidence of that. This is a picture from Northeast India in Assam, where this electric fence had been built to keep the elephants from coming through a tea garden and into the adjacent farmlands during harvest season. There was evidence on the other side of elephant footprints, meaning that they had come the night before, had been gathered there, because this is the way that they had gotten used to coming into, to the farms. So they'd been gathered there trying to figure out, okay, how do we get past? So it was almost like an elephant meeting had occurred on the other side, but they hadn't figured it out at that time. But they may eventually, because there are some incredible stories from the field of how, of the different things that elephants have done to get past barriers that are put in their way to get to what they really want to get to. I've heard stories of elephants carrying a log in their trunk and coming over and dropping it on an electric fence to break the current, because they've learned that you drop something heavy, it breaks it, and they can get over. And this other video that I'd like to share right now is another really interesting point where tuskers in Asia, only males grow tusks, and only a certain percentage of males today grow tusks. So tuskers have realized that tusks don't conduct electricity. So this fellow realized that his tusks were a really good tool to try to break that, electric fence. He tries different things to make sure he's very carefully, putting his leg out to see if it doesn't touch it. And now if you'll see this footage, you'll see that he has carefully lifted his trunk, so that doesn't touch the fence, but then he's very carefully using the tusks to push the fence down. So these are some of the things that they do to be able to get past the barriers and to what they, sort of really want. Another really important thing that we've been working with communities on the ground is on developing response teams. It's very similar to, bear response teams where, you have these, what we call anti-depredation squads in India, for instance, or response teams elsewhere, where community members are trained in elephant biology and safe ways to drive elephants away from community areas and crop fields so that both elephants and people are safe. Here's a demonstration of one of our staff members in India showing the community teams on how to safely and effectively build an electric fence for the community. And then in addition to that, we want to ensure that if people are experiencing crop losses to wildlife, elephants and other wildlife, that they also have buffers. They have alternative livelihood opportunities to buffer these losses that they may incur from traditional crops like rice or maize or corn. So we also have been working with communities to help them grow alternative crops that are unpalatable to elephants and many other wildlife species, but are also high yield crops that then bring in a good income for the communities. So this is an example. This is in Indonesia, where we've worked with communities to grow lemongrass. In Nepal, we've worked with communities to grow crops like mentha and chamomile. Mentha is used in the production of mint. And chamomile, as you know, is used in teas and other, sort of medicinal purposes. So these bring in high yields, but also don't suffer from losses as a result of, elephants or other wildlife. Next, we go to another Asian species, which is the tiger, another flagship species of ours. And this is an image from the Sundarbans landscape in southeast, or just off the coast of the Bay of Bengal, bordering India and Bangladesh. So this area is very unique because it's the only coastal mangrove tiger habitat in the world. There are about WWF works on the Indian side of the Sundarbans, and on the Indian side, there are like around 100 or so tigers in this landscape. And it is also a rough terrain because it's mangrove habitat, and these tigers are also excellent swimmers in this place. And if you look at this image, you'll see that the darker green patches are part of the protected area where tigers live and other wildlife. The lighter beige areas are community areas. And the only thing that they're separated by here are these rivers that are part of the mangrove system. And because I mentioned the tigers are excellent swimmers, they sometimes tend to swim across these rivers and into community areas, either in search of livestock as food, or may just stray into these villages without realizing what's happening. And then it leads to cases of human-tiger conflict, where tigers may then become trapped in the village and may accidentally attack people. So a tool that we've used there is nylon net fencing to keep tigers out of community areas, and that's been really successful. As the tide rises in this area, the nets are installed in a way that the tigers aren't able to swim over the tide. So it's based on the height of the tide that rises. But also there's a belief that for some reason, the yellow coloring of the nylon net fencing is a psychological barrier for tigers and that they don't cross. Whatever the reason may be, it's actually been really successful since it's been installed. And we have not had any tiger incursions into villages since they've been put out. In addition to that, tigers tend to come into villages in the cover of darkness. They are, ambush predators. They like to move about in the dark. So at night, these villagers are actually very, the surrounding areas are quite dark, and gives the opportunity for tigers to come into them. So another tool that we've worked with communities to install is solar electric fencing at the boundaries of these villages. And since these have been installed, they're on all night. There has not been a single tiger incursion into the villages. So that's been successful in keeping people and tigers apart in these situations. Another factor is that people go into the biosphere reserve or the protected area to either fish or collect wild honey. These are some of the key livelihood sources for communities living in these areas. So when they're in the tiger habitat, then they're actually very vulnerable to tiger attacks. Here in this picture, you'll see people are out fishing. They would have no idea if a tiger crept up behind them from the mangrove and ambushed them. And tigers have been known to take fishermen off of boats as well as they're fishing. But also in terms of wild honey collectors, there have been a number of wild honey collectors that have previously been attacked and killed by tigers in the protected areas. So as a solution, particularly for honey collection, excuse me, we have worked with communities of licensed honey collectors to put in bee boxes in contained or confined areas where the wild bees, you make the honey and create sort of a harvest for these honey collectors that are then able to harvest and sell the honey in a safe way. So this program is called Blood Free Honey. because it prevents human-tiger interactions, but also provides these communities with a safe source of income. And this method of sort of producing honey has yielded some really good results. And the teams have been working with, helping these communities market the honey at a higher rate for as, organic, sustainable honey product that then can be bought by folks at a premium rate. So these are some of the interventions that have been, implemented in the Sundarbans. And then if you look at another big cat that we work with, which is the snow leopard, found in the high mountains of Asia, found in 12 countries in Asia. Snow leopards normally subsist on, mountain prey species like markhor, blue sheep, that are very agile mountain species. Snow leopards themselves are very agile. They have to be able to hunt, these species on very craggy outcroppings and very steep inclines. However, we found that in the past, due to declining numbers of prey species or easier access to livestock, snow leopards have been attacking, livestock belonging to nomadic herder communities that also live in those areas. Livestock are kept at night in pens, which are surrounded by a fence, but are open up top. So snow leopards, being the agile cat that they are, can jump in from above and, take the livestock. They don't necessarily even have to kill all of them for food. One swipe of a big paw can mean that about 10 or 15 goats can be killed in, one visit. So this can be significant loss for communities because generally household income can be about $250 to $400 or so, and livestock losses can amount from about $50 to about $300. So this is a huge loss for communities if they're losing their only source of income to snow leopards, so which can then in turn lead to retaliatory killings. So in this situation, what we've worked with communities to do is to install these predator-proof livestock pens, as you can see in this image, where the opening above has now a sort of wire mesh enclosure so that snow leopards can't jump in from above. Very simple solution, but it has really helped save a lot of goats, maintain people's livelihoods, and keep snow leopards safe in turn as well. In addition to this, we have helped communities establish local community-based insurance schemes where any losses incurred to snow leopards are then insured and compensated to the owner of the goats or whatever livestock that they're holding. So these have also proven to be quite effective in a number of different snow leopard range countries. So these are some of the things that we have been doing. However, it's really important to note that many of these tools are, addressing human-wildlife conflict as it occurs to prevent it and manage it. But for long-term sustainability of managing human-wildlife conflict, we really have to take a very holistic approach. That means not just addressing when it's happening in real time, but also addressing the drivers of human-wildlife conflict. If we can't address, issues like habitat loss or the impacts of climate change that may be leading to changes, in the landscapes or, the connections that human-wildlife conflict may have to poaching or other significant threats to wildlife, we will not be able to have or see any significant long-term impacts without that holistic approach. So, WWF is working on in terms of addressing conflict and looking at a very, very holistic way to address and manage the issue. So, but before I wrap up, I want to actually share my own personal story of human-wildlife conflict that happened to me a couple of years ago. So, if you look at these guys, this is from the island of Gibraltar. These are Barbary macaques. Some of you may have been there and may have experienced these guys, but many places that you go to, if there are monkeys running around, you're going to encounter them in tourist areas, in cultural sites and things like that. As you're going to visit, these monkeys have learned over time that people mean food. So they, and the more people feed them, the more attracted they become to, coming in, sort of grabbing food from your hands or your bag or holding your phone hostage in turn for, a bag of chips or something like that. So this, I'm sure, is something that many of you have experienced in your travels. And my own experience was, I was back in my home country of Sri Lanka a few years ago, giving a presentation at a workshop being held for the wildlife department. This was in a rather rural area surrounded by, a national park, and it was beautiful, right by a lake. There was wildlife around, and, at points we had seen monkeys up in trees. This was a house that we stayed in. And, one morning as we were getting ready to go out and give our presentations, put our stuff away, the breeze was so gorgeous from the lake that we left the windows open, thinking, let it, just go through the house, and it'll be lovely by the time we get back, because it's also quite hot there. Little did we realize that just outside the window were monkeys hanging around, and I had no idea that they were there at the time. And we came back in the evening after the session and found this mangled roll of toilet paper. We're like, what happened in here? And then there were other signs of, that something had happened. And then the first thing I noticed was this coveted packet of cashew nuts that a friend had given me, and that I was saving for a snack sometime later in the evening, was gone. There were maybe a couple of stray cashews lying on the floor, but for the most part, it was gone. And I was like, okay, what happened here? Like, who came in, who stole the stuff and destroyed everything? And then I look out the window, and on the balcony was this female toque macaque, or bonnet macaque, sitting there with a humi look on her face. And I was like, oh dear, we've been had. So without realizing it, leaving the window open meant that, we had left room for these monkeys to come in, rifle through our things. And at that moment, I was so thankful that I had packed my makeup away that morning before we left for the session. Or, we might have come back to her with a red lip on, trying to figure out how to use the rest of it. So this was, my own experience with, human-wildlife conflict. We all live and learn, right? So that was an occasion where if you're in a wild area, a wild place with wildlife outside, you have to always be cautious and careful. Monkeys are also extremely intelligent. And so, not leave them opportunities to get into trouble. But also, as you're traveling, it's really important. In our own way, there's a lot we could do to prevent human-wildlife conflict. When you're traveling, please don't feed wildlife, because doing that only makes them bolder and look at humans as a source of food. They become more aggressive, and then they're bound to get into trouble by, either trying to aggressively grab your food or hurt you trying to get it. So this can lead to all sorts of situations that are not advisable or safe for both humans and wildlife. So with that story, I will end my presentation, and I'm more than happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. And please share all your questions. I'm happy to talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nalanga, for sharing your stories and your important work with us. And now we will turn to the questions you all have from the Google form, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can. So Nalanga, our first question is from Leslie. Leslie asks, do unique diseases like Ebola and coronavirus occur more in areas of human-wildlife conflict due to either eating or handling wildlife? And what is World Wildlife doing to minimize these occurrences?
Thank you, Leslie, for that question. There is high likelihood of, zoonotic disease transmission in these cases of human-wildlife conflict. As we have found, it's more, as the current pandemic has demonstrated, it has been more along the lines of, consumption of wildlife that then leads to a transfer of the zoonotic disease, jump over to humans. But there is also a likelihood in these cases. It has not been, there haven't been any proven cases of that disease transfer in cases of just interaction in events of human-wildlife conflict. But there is likelihood of that happening in the future in places where disease may be prevalent in the wild that may not otherwise have an opportunity to jump over to humans. And also WWF is currently, has been working on issues of wildlife crime for many, many years, and addressing the illegal sale of wildlife in markets. And so we continue to do that work, but also are, looking at the issue of pandemics and how do we prevent such pandemics in the future by, regulating markets or, other ways to looking at ways to detect such things that may be going on on the ground in various places, but also really working on, what we have always worked on as well, enabling, making sure that habitat is protected. The more we lose habitat, or the more deforestation and other threats to, wild places happen, the more there's a chance of these, illnesses or diseases being released from the environment that may have otherwise been contained by healthy forests, et cetera, or wildlife. So we will continue to work on, our, habitat protection measures, wildlife protection measures, as well as, working on issues like climate change, to ensure that, we're working as hard as we can to prevent such issues from happening in the future. I hope that helped answer your question. Thanks again.
Our next question is from Valentina. What should the overarching goals be for conservation action and legislation concerning human-wildlife conflict?
Thank you, Valentina. I think the overarching goals should really be a reduction of it. I mean, I think it's also really important to note that it doesn't just affect communities, that living with wildlife. It affects national governments, because it could affect the economy of the government as, more people end up losing their livelihoods or impacted economically as a result of human-wildlife conflict. It may impact companies that are sourcing from areas, like products that they need for, whatever they're selling or they're developing. It may impact development agendas, because if you're not, doing sustainable development, human-wildlife conflict can only increase in those situations. So that can also then put a, sort of a barrier in the way of actual development happening in these countries. So there are multiple ripple-on effects from human-wildlife conflict that go well beyond just the immediate act of, a community member or an elephant or a tiger being impacted by it. So I think government legislation, or at the policy level, should very much look at both ways to manage it on the ground, but also looking at ways to address drivers, as I mentioned before. How can they do effective land use planning to ensure that unsustainable or unplanned development isn't happening in certain parts of their country that then lead to increased human-wildlife conflict? Are wildlife corridors being blocked by, unplanned development? Is that going to only increase human-wildlife conflict as wildlife still continue to try to move through those areas that they've historically moved through? So there are many, many things that, governments and other stakeholders can do. But I think it has to really have a very holistic approach, because, addressing one or two things, just putting up a fence here, doing something else there, it's just not going to be effective. There is no silver bullet to address human-wildlife conflict, and it must be really addressed in a very holistic way. And we are, have been working with governments to sort of add that level as well at the policy level to discuss some of these things that can be done on the ground. Thank you.
Our next question is from Doreen. How does the number of animals lost to human-wildlife conflict compare to poaching in Africa in particular?
Thank you, Doreen, for that question. So that one's a little bit harder to kind of quantify, because there has been no standard way of monitoring the effects of human-wildlife conflict across regions and across countries. So because of that, it's really hard to say X number of, animals may have been lost in X number of countries on the African continent, or X number of people may have been lost. And, sometimes human casualties, for instance, are recorded, but not all of them are also recorded. Sometimes people are engaging in illegal activity and they're killed as a result of human-wildlife conflict. They're also reluctant to report that as, something that occurred, from human-wildlife conflict. So the reporting mechanisms in general need, or monitoring mechanisms need to be improved for us to really understand and gauge what the impacts of conflict overall have been. From some countries and some regions, we have some of the data, which I had mentioned during my presentation as well, but it's not available widely, which makes it a little difficult to compare it with, cases of poaching, but also, poaching and the rates of it and where it's happening and how it's happening may also differ from how the human-wildlife conflict is happening. In some cases, they may be connected. If human-wildlife conflict is happening, for instance, if there are elephants in your area that are damaging your crops, people may not hesitate to point poachers in the direction of those elephants if they're coming to get the tusks for the ivory trade. So those are some of the connections. But I think in short, I have to say I'm afraid that the data isn't as robust and as available to be able to answer that question. Thank you.
So Nalanga, we have time for one more question, and our final question comes from Radha. Is WWF working on a high-level plan to create elephant corridors to reduce incidences of human-wildlife conflict? And does WWF work with local nonprofits on efforts like these?
Yes, thank you, Radha, for the question. It's dependent on the countries. In different countries, we are working on sort of these plans for maintaining connectivity, corridor plans. In India, for instance, WWF is part of a coalition, a corridor coalition that's working to maintain, a lot of the corridors that are found in the country. There are other places where we're working on similar efforts, but we also have a network-wide effort called Wildlife Connect, where the entire network has come together, WWF network has come together to look at ways to maintain connectivity in these very complex multi-use landscapes that often are, kind of dotted with different land use types and, communities living there and other, uses that then prevent wildlife from easily or safely crossing in ways that they need to. So there are efforts in the works and ongoing and have been for a while. So we are working on them. And also to answer your second question, yes, we do work with other local nonprofits and NGOs in the countries that we work in, but also governments are key partners because much of the wildlife is under the authority or the management of either a wildlife department or a forest department in those countries. So, they have the authority to manage the wildlife, but also, we have, so we work very closely with them, but also with the local communities and many other stakeholders. Sometimes we work with, farmers or ranchers or, sort of development agencies or other groups that are, that have a stake in this issue or are interested in engaging or have impacts from, human-wildlife conflict. Food security is a big issue as a result of human-wildlife conflict. So we have to think beyond, the stakeholders that we would normally think are the obvious people that we need to work with. To think of, a much broader group of people that we have to work with and come together on so that we can affect long-term sustainable change to manage human-wildlife conflict. Thank you again for the question.
Thank you all for your questions, and that will do it for us for this afternoon. I want to say thanks again to Nalanga for sharing your work with us, and thanks to everyone who carved out time in your schedules to join us today for this installment of our Insiders Virtual Event Series. We're going to be following up with an email that includes a link to today's recording, along with a survey about your experience. We want to make sure we adjust and improve future events where we can, so please be honest. We also hope you'll share the recording with your family and friends. Finally, please mark your calendars for the next installment of the WWF Insiders Virtual Event Series. On Thursday, July 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we will hear from Nikhil Advani, Director of Climate, Communities, and Wildlife, about his work on innovative solutions to help wildlife adapt to our changing climate. And keep checking your email inbox or wwf.events.org for information on future installments of the Insider Series. Thank you again for joining us and for your commitment to conservation and WWF. See you next time.
Your passion and generosity are helping build a more resilient future for nature and people. And while we are all staying home and staying safe, your commitment is still helping to make conservation progress happen all over the world. From the U.S. Northern Great Plains to the Arctic, from the Eastern Himalayas to the savannas of Africa, your commitment fuels work that safeguards local communities, iconic wildlife, and vast land and waterscapes. Together, we're developing innovative solutions to ensure the health of our planet.
Your support is helping to take us to a whole new level in our work.
Support that people like you have provided has achieved so much.
Thank you for your generous support.
Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you for your support.
We can't do the work that we do alone.
We're doing all of this great work at WWF. We have all of these amazing supporters out there. And it is really nice to be able to connect with the people that enable us to do this work.